In this video lecture, we're going to discuss writing research questions. Let's quickly review the things we discussed that are related to writing research questions. We talked about basic and applied research. We talked about the two basic questions for any research project. We talked about the three audiences for our research projects. We talked about the scientific method itself. We talked about vocab terms that are related to research questions. We're going to focus on this last one a little bit here. The vocab terms we need to make sure that we know are research question, hypothesis, specifically one and two-tailed hypotheses, a theory, an independent and a dependent variable, a nominal and ordinal variable, and correlation versus causation. We're going to use all of these moving forward. So let's discuss what we're going to discuss in this lesson. We're going to talk about inventing research topics. We're going to talk about inventing research goals. We're going to talk about phrasing research questions, and we're going to talk about phrasing hypotheses. Let's focus on inventing research topics first. So, inventing research topics. This is often an area where people struggle. I know that I myself have a lot of trouble with this, and like, well, gee, I need to investigate something. I just don't know what I want to look at. Gee, I don't know, I'm lost. It's really not that hard. You kind of got to get over yourself. You want to identify some sort of broad subject that interests you. So you're in technical communication. Is there something about TCOM that you notice in your personal and professional life? You're in psychology. What have I read in my psych books? What have I encountered in my classes that makes me say, what's going on with that? Why is it that way? Is there something in your courses, in your life, and it's related to TCOM or psychology or whatever major you're in, that makes you say, well, this seems interesting, but nobody talked about this. I don't understand why nobody said anything. Well, hey, guess what? You found a research topic. Once you found a research topic, you want to invent some goals to go along with that topic. So start looking at narrower issues. So you could say, well, I'm interested in TCOM, and I like editing. I like seeing what people, helping people make their text better and so on. But what's the real problem with editing? You could be in psychology and say, all right, well, I'm interested in, for example, psychedelics. Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a whole lot of stuff going on with that right now. And I wonder what previous researchers have done about that. So you do a literature review, find out what other people have said. Thing is, you want to identify gaps in the research. A gap is, a gap. It is a hole. It's something that needs to be filled. So when we talk about research gaps, these could be things like topics nobody has talked about before. If there are flaws in the existing research, if the existing research is dated and needs to be updated, maybe the results are too narrow. They focus on just this one little thing where it needs to say, well, what about all these other possibilities? You get the idea here. So I've got a little bit of a infographic that may help you understand. These are just some types of research gaps. So there could be not enough evidence. People may not, the researchers may not know what they're looking at yet. So there's a knowledge gap. We just don't know what's going on. Practical knowledge, well, there may be a theory, but do we know how the rubber meets the road? Do we have a problem with the methodology in the other studies? Is there a better way to run a study that you know? Maybe there's just evidence is lacking. People have made theory without fully grounding it in reality. This could be an opportunity. Theory. Maybe nobody has developed a theory about something yet. It's just, well, we know this happens in this particular case. Well, great. Can we do some more studies and build a bigger theory about this? Go inductive. Population. Is the population that has been studied the correct population? Maybe it's too small. Maybe we need to say, what about these people over here? Would their results be different? These are just some possibilities. So identify gaps in the research that you can help answer new ideas. So let's talk then about phrasing research questions. So you need to identify the independent and dependent variables that are at play. So start writing some basic questions. Please note, basic means stupid, dumb, obvious, etc. The questions that you start to write will be ridiculous. They will be poorly phrased. That's okay. Your first couple attempts, they are just going to be there. You aren't going to be able to use them. You will need to revise them multiple times. Thing is, you just keep going at it, keep going at it. It's like sharpening a pencil. You start taking a couple of grinds at the thing. Well, it's still dull. Grind some more. Okay, I'm starting to see a lead here. Grind, grind, grind. Pretty soon you have a fine point that you can actually write with. Same thing going on here. Your first attempts, not very good. They'll be broad, blunt objects. You will develop a good question over time. Matter of fact, when I started doing this PowerPoint, I have some examples at the end that'll help illustrate everything we're talking about. They were terrible, absolutely terrible the first couple of times I tried it. Then, as I went on, like, okay, refine, refine, refine. And I think I've got some good examples here. They aren't fantastic, but that's the point. I'm going to still need to revise these things in order to make them really, really good. So let's talk more about phrasing research questions. Oh, I need to emphasize this. You will revise your research questions as your study progresses. Now, this may seem a little peculiar to some of you because are we actually allowed to revise a research question? It depends with what you're talking about. If you're in the medical sciences, for example, Dr. Smith over here, she's going to say, no, what are you doing? No, you cannot revise a research question. You have to have everything completely set up before you start your study. Otherwise, your study is no good. Well, yeah, in medicine and things like that, then yes. But in the humanities and social sciences, no. Here's the deal. Medical research and the like works off a thing we call the TCOM framework. It says you got to have everything all set up, then you start your research, otherwise your research doesn't count. So what does the TCOM framework mean? I'm going to show you. It means population, intervention, comparison, outcome, and type of studies. It's an acronym. So if we look at this, population, who is the population being studied? Intervention, what is the researcher doing to the population? Comparison, what sort of results, what are they comparing? What are the independent variables that they are looking for? And the outcome, the dependent variable. And of course, there's different types of studies as well, but we're going to ignore that for the moment. For example, here's a research question from the medical research literature. In adults with chronic neck pain, what is the minimum dose of manipulation necessary to produce a clinically important improvement in neck pain compared to supervised exercise at 6 weeks? Population, adults with chronic neck pain. Intervention, manipulation. Comparison, minimum dose of manipulation and supervised exercise at 6 weeks. Outcome, a clinically important improvement in neck pain. So if we look at this, we can start to understand how they will set up medical studies. Thing is, when we were talking the humanities, the social sciences, we don't follow that framework. If we can, it'd be fantastic, but it just doesn't really work that way. Our research is based on, again, the scientific method. We observe what's going on in the world, we think of a question, make a hypothesis, develop some predictions, test the hypothesis. If the hypothesis doesn't work, okay, you get this idea. You've seen this before. This is actually very similar to the human-centered design model. Some of you may be very familiar with this. We look at something in the world, we say, I think here's what's going on. I'm going to design some sort of prototype that will, like a prototype app. I'm going to test my app. I'm going to observe if it worked or not. I will rethink my app. Then I will change it to a new prototype. I will test it over and over again. So this sort of thing is what we're talking about. So the thing is, in the humanities, we don't really do lab-based experimental research. In psychology, which is a social science, it is possible to do this sort of thing. But again, if you bring people into a lab, then they act differently when they're in a lab. So we sometimes go do field studies, all right? So the thing is here that if you do a field study, well, you may suddenly discover that, this thing I had planned is not working in the field. I've got to adapt somehow. So you will revise your approach as you go even then. We work in the real world, as I mentioned. We have to then based on what we find in the real world, we have to adapt our studies. Sometimes we have to backtrack. We have to rethink what we're doing. We have to revise our study as we go. There's a word that came up a lot when I was in grad school taking a research methods class. It is messy. Research is unlikely to be clean and simple. There's always some sort of wrinkle going on. There's a problem of some kind. Thing is, you need to embrace these problems and realize, okay, cool. The problem itself shows me something. I need to proceed and do the best I can. So let's get back to where we were leaving off the last time about phrasing research questions. We talked about all this stuff. So let's move on to part 2 of phrasing research questions. Are your independent variables nominal or are they ordinal? If they are nominal, that is, if the independent variables are just labels, use this formula for writing a research question. Is there a difference between independent variable A and independent variable B as shown in this dependent variable? If your independent variable is ordinal, then try this formula. Is there a relationship between the two, between independent variable and this particular dependent variable that I'm measuring? Please note these are starters. They just help you get the basics down on paper, down on screen. You will revise them and make them slicker, easier to read, easier to understand. But this will get you started anyway because it helps you clearly identify what your independent variables, dependent variables, and your independent variables and your dependent variables are. Now that you've got your research questions written, and you will go back and revise your research questions, let's talk about phrasing some hypotheses to go with research questions. Are your independent variables nominal or ordinal? If they're nominal, there are two possibilities. For a two-tailed, say a difference exists in the dependent variable with respect to independent variable and independent variable. On the other hand, if you're looking for a one-tailed outcome, then independent variable A is greater or less on independent variable than with the other independent variable. Quick review, what do one and two-tailed mean? Two-tailed hypothesis says there's a difference of some kind. I don't know if it's positive or negative, up or down, back, left, back, forward, left, right. The difference is that some sort of difference exists. The one-tailed hypothesis predicts which way it goes, up, down, more than, less than, left of, right of, etc. If your independent variables are ordinal, then you can say for a two-tailed, independent variable A and B are somehow related. For a one-tailed, you'd say that there is a positive relationship or a negative relationship between independent variable and a dependent variable. Again, these are starters. You will rephrase them as you go. So that's it. Boom. Hey, it's all done. We've talked about writing research questions, but it's kind of abstract, yeah? How about we throw in some examples and see how this works? Oh, you want? Yes, you do want. Okay, sure. I can do that for you. Not a problem. So let's use a published article as a starter, just to give us an idea of something we might talk about. I'm doing some reading. Oh, hey, eye tracking, deceptive tactics, line graphs. Ooh, this is interesting. So maybe my interest has peaked. I'm going to investigate this. So I need to invent a topic. Line graphs, something about line graphs. These things can be deceptive, they can be honest, but when people read these things, what influences the way they read them? I don't know, just line graph. There's all sorts of stuff I could talk about. So what am I going to talk about? What exactly is going on with line graphs? Maybe I should see what's going on in the professional literature. So there's that one paper. Maybe I should look at some other papers and see what the various researchers figured out. What have they said? Maybe they found some things and I could follow up my own study, or hey, maybe I can find a gap in the research, something they haven't looked at. So I've done my reading. I found a literature review. Oh, by the way, those of you who are paying attention, you will notice that list is not done in APA format. It was done in the IEEE format. It's one of the ones that is commonly, well, I shouldn't say commonly used. It's sometimes used in TCOM. I hate it. It's the worst. But I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so I copied. Moving on. I figured out a couple of things from literature review. I figured out that line graphs contain lots of deceptive tactics. Nobody has ever used eye tracking software besides that one study to figure out how do people react to deceptive tactics and titles and captions. They also seem to affect how people interact with graphics. So I'm going to try to identify some independent and dependent variables here. What might they be? Well, things I can manipulate and things I can measure. What can I manipulate? I can create graphics that are and aren't deceptive. I can put on or take off captions. I can adjust the title or captions contents themselves, so I can write something that is very succinct and to the point. Maybe I could do something wordy. It's all sorts of possibilities. I could tell people what to look for, and that would definitely change the way they interact. I could or could not tell them I'm going to ask them questions later, because if I ask them questions, that would definitely cue them in. So probably I don't want to ask them questions. You get the idea here. I'm enlisting independent variables, things that can affect outcomes. What can I measure? I can look at where people look on screen if I'm using eye tracking materials. I can look at how long people look at the materials. I can see what do these people, what do they say about the content. So yeah, I could measure all these things. Yeah. What do all the independent variables have in common? What they do? They are all nominal variables. They're all ones that fit in categories. They don't have any numbers associated with them. No rankings, no hierarchies. So these are nominal. When I start writing my research questions and hypotheses, I'm going to go with the formulas for the nominal independent variables. So I'm going to write some starter research questions. So here's my formula, and these aren't going to be very good. I'm just going to start writing questions and see what comes out. Okay, are there differences between independent variables? Okay, I got deceptive line graphs. They got captions, maybe no captions. Oh yeah, I also have non-deceptive graphs that have captions and non-deceptive graphs that don't have captions. And the dependent variables, I could look at how long do people look at the graphs, and I could also look at where users look at the graphs. Ooh, wow, that's a really overstuffed research question, isn't it? Yeah, that's super complicated. I can't use that. Well, it doesn't matter. I've written it down. It helps me think. So now, realistically, I could list just a crap ton of research questions based on independent variables and dependent variables that we listed on the previous screen. But I'm going to try to keep it simple, so I'm going to give you two more as examples. Is there a difference between deceptive and non-deceptive line graphs as shown in where users look at the graphs? So I can, deceptive, non-deceptive, and eye tracking, where they look. Okay. How about deceptive and non-deceptive, how long they look? Yeah, I could measure both of these things, and they would actually complement each other really, really well. Well, that's cool, but for the purposes of our example here, I'm just going to focus on one of them. So I'm going to try to rephrase one of these things so it's actually readable and understandable in English. I'm going to focus on this one here just because, all right? So deceptive and non-deceptive line graphs, how long users look at the graphs. All right, so I put it up at the top, and I'm going to try to rephrase it. I could write it a bunch of different ways. For example, I could say, do deceptive or non-deceptive line graphs attract more user attention? Do users look at deceptive line graphs longer than non-deceptive graphs? How long do users look at deceptive line graphs versus non-deceptive line graphs? Do users look at deceptive or non-deceptive line graphs longer? Which one is best? Yes, they're all not very good. They all need refining. They are at least plausibly usable, though. So notice that I can rephrase so that this fairly stilted thing up top works in plain English. Now, that being said, when I go through the rest of this example, I'm going to be using the fairly stilted version up at top about is there a difference between. That's because it's easy to identify my IVs and DVs, so I'm just going to run with it. But in our actual write-up, in my actual study, I would use a rephrased question that actually makes sense in English. So let's write some hypotheses. Are my IVs nominal or ordinal? Well, I've got two possibilities. I could say a difference exists, or independent variable is greater or less than. So which is going on here? Well, I've got my independent and my two independent variables, my dependent variable. Which am I going to use? I'll tell you what. I'm going to try to write a one-tailed hypothesis here. One-tailed hypothesis, again, predicts a difference and the directionality of the difference. So I'm going to take this research question, put it up top, and try to write some hypotheses. So I'm going to use my formula and say, all right, the presence of deceptive elements in line graphs, that is my independent variable A, will increase. All right, so I've got directionality here. The length of time users spend looking at graphs, that is my dependent variable. And this time will be greater than the length of time the users spend looking at non-deceptive line graphs, independent variable B. Fairly stilted, yeah? So let's try rephrasing it. Users will spend more time looking at deceptive line graphs than at non-deceptive line graphs. President and Mrs. Obama, they say not bad. Is it fantastic? No. Is it good enough to run with? Yes. We can go with this. So we have gone from figuring out generally what are we talking about to, okay, here's a specific topic that I might investigate, to here's a research question, to here's a hypothesis that I can actually test. So you've seen how this process works. Thus far, we have talked about inventing research topics, inventing research goals, phrasing research questions, and phrasing hypotheses. So you got this? Well, you may be a little bit puzzled. That's okay. Not a problem. You can do this. Many people in the world have learned this. You are able to do so as well. Things you need to keep in mind. Identify your variables, independent, dependent variables. Follow the formulas that I've provided. And then once you've filled out the formulas, rephrase them. Then things will start to make sense. That's the end of this PowerPoint.